There is a discipline that exists at the intersection of psychology, neuroscience, criminology, and mathematics. It's a field that most people don't think about until they have reason to, until they read a news story about someone they thought they knew committing an act that seems incomprehensible, until they wonder, in the darkness, what separates the people we trust from the people we fear. This is the study of criminal psychology, and what it reveals is both more mundane and more terrifying than most people realize. I'm Dr. Elizabeth Chen, and I've spent 23 years studying the patterns of human violence. Not in an abstract theoretical sense, though I've published plenty of theory. I've spent my career in consultation with law enforcement agencies, in prison interview rooms, in courtrooms, and in the field working backward from crime scenes to understand the person who created them. What I'm about to share with you is not sensationalized entertainment. It's not a parade of monsters designed to horrify or titillate. It's the actual science of how we understand why people commit violent crimes, and more importantly, how we might predict and prevent them before they happen. The study of criminal behavior starts with a simple but profound observation. Human violence is not random. This seems obvious when you say it aloud. Of course, violence isn't random, but what most people don't understand is how consistent, how patterned, how almost mathematical violent behavior actually is. When you look at thousands of cases, when you examine crime scenes and victim selection and method of killing and disposal patterns, what emerges is something startling. Violence has signatures, behavior patterns, predictable escalations, almost like a language that each offender speaks in their own dialect, but using grammar that we've learned to read. I started my career in traditional psychology. I did clinical work. I saw patients with anxiety disorders, depression, trauma responses, normal psychological practice. But in graduate school, I became fascinated by a particular question. What makes someone hurt another person? Not in self-defense, not in the heat of passion, but with intention, with planning, with the kind of deliberation that suggests something fundamentally different about how that person's brain works. That question led me down a path I didn't anticipate. It led me to law enforcement. It led me to behavioral analysis. And it led me to understand that violent crime is, in many ways, a solvable puzzle if you know how to read the patterns. The first pattern that anyone studying criminal psychology learns about is this. The offender always leaves a signature, not a fingerprint, not DNA. Those are evidence. But a signature is different. It's the way an offender personalizes their crime. It's the unnecessary things they do, the things that don't serve the immediate goal of the crime, but that serve the psychological needs of the offender. A burglar might steal money and jewelry, but they might also defecate in the home they've broken into. A rapist might inflict physical injury far beyond what's necessary to overpower their victim. A murderer might arrange the body in a particular way, or leave a message or remove a specific part of the victim. These aren't accidents. These aren't random components of the crime. These are the offender's fingerprint on the psychological structure of what they've done. I learned this lesson very early in my consulting work. In a case I'm permitted to discuss because it's been resolved and is a matter of public record. In the late 1990s, there was a series of home invasions in a mid-sized city in the Pacific Northwest. Over a period of about 18 months, 8 homes were broken into. In 7 of those invasions, the occupants were not home. In 1, they were. The victim in that case was a woman in her 60s. She was assaulted but not killed. She survived and was able to provide a description to police. But the description was vague. The perpetrator was careful. He'd been wearing a mask, gloves, dark clothing. The police had evidence from each scene, forced entry points, items stolen, but the cases weren't connecting. different neighborhoods, different times, no obvious pattern beyond the fact that they were all residential burglaries. Law enforcement brought me in to look at the crime scenes and the reports. And the first thing I noticed was that in every single case, the offender had done something unnecessary, something that didn't fit with simple burglary. In one home, the burglar had eaten food from the victim's refrigerator, not stolen it, but eaten it, leaving the empty containers on the kitchen counter. In another home, the burglar had gone into the victim's bedroom and masturbated on the bed, leaving biological evidence. In a third home, the burglar had destroyed photographs on the wall, slashing them with a knife, but had left other valuables untouched. In a fourth home, the burglar had urinated in the victim's bathtub. These weren't the actions of someone interested primarily in theft. These were the actions of someone who was using the burglary as a vehicle for something else: dominance, invasion of personal space, violation of the victim's sanctuary. I told the police that they weren't dealing with a traditional burglar. They were dealing with someone who had a sexual component to their motivation, even though only one home invasion had involved direct sexual assault. The motivation was about power and control and intrusion. The theft was secondary. Armed with this understanding, the investigation shifted. Police looked for sexual offenders in the area. They looked for people with a history of intrusions, of boundary violations. And within 3 months, they'd identified a suspect, a man in his early 30s who had a prior conviction for indecent exposure and had recently been released from incarceration. When confronted with the evidence, he confessed to all 8 home invasions. He'd deliberately targeted homes where he believed the occupants would not be present, except for the one case where he'd miscalculated. And yes, he confirmed what the evidence suggested. The burglary was the vehicle. The goal was the intrusion, the feeling of being in someone else's intimate space without their knowledge or consent. That was my introduction to the concept of criminal signature, and it became the foundation of my entire career. The next pattern that emerged in my research was escalation. I started tracking offenders across their careers, looking at the progression of their crimes over time. What I found was consistent. Most offenders don't begin with their worst crime. They build toward it. They escalate. Someone who commits rape usually has a history of less serious sexual offenses: exposure, voyeurism, harassment. The brain learns that these behaviors are possible, the inhibitions against them lower, and the urge intensifies. Eventually, the person commits more serious crimes. Someone who commits murder often has a history of violence, assault, domestic abuse, animal cruelty. The person has learned to override the natural human inhibition against harming others. They've done it once. The second time is easier. The third time becomes almost routine. This escalation pattern is so consistent that it forms one of the foundational principles of criminal psychology. Offenders almost never appear in the system with their most serious crime. They build their way there, leaving a trail of lesser offenses behind them. Law enforcement uses this principle to profile unknown offenders. If you have a serious violent crime and no suspect, you can look backward. You can examine whether there have been any crimes in that area that might represent an earlier stage of the same offender's escalation. The person who exposed themselves in a park 3 years ago might be the person who committed rape last month. The person who abused their spouse might be the person who killed someone this week. The logic is sound, and it works with remarkable consistency. I consulted on a case where this principle was critical. A woman had been murdered in her apartment in a major city. The murder was brutal. There were signs of sexual motivation. The body had been arranged. There were what we call overkill injuries, damage far beyond what was necessary to cause death, suggesting that the offender had emotional investment in what happened. Police had no suspect. They had no obvious connection to the victim. She was a random target, which made the case harder. How do you find someone connected to a victim they didn't know? I suggested that we look for offenders with a trajectory. If this person had murdered a stranger, they'd almost certainly committed sexual crimes before. The question was, where? Where in the city's crime database would we find reports of sexual assault, rape, exposure, voyeurism over the past 5 to 10 years? Police compiled a list of registered sex offenders who lived in or near the victim's neighborhood. 93 names. Then they examined each person's criminal history, who had shown progression, who had started with lesser offenses and escalated. One man stood out. He had a conviction for voyeurism from 12 years prior. He'd served time, been released, stayed off the radar for nearly a decade. But 3 years ago, there had been a report of a woman who'd been assaulted in a parking garage. The assault had sexual components, but hadn't resulted in rape. The victim got away. The case was never solved, but the description roughly matched this offender. Police brought him in for questioning. He denied everything at first, but when confronted with the evidence of his history, his prior conviction, the escalation pattern, he began to crack. Eventually, he confessed to the murder, the parking garage assault, and several other sexual crimes that had never been reported or solved. The escalation pattern had worked. By understanding how criminal behavior develops, we've been able to identify a killer who would have otherwise continued to operate undetected. But here's what's important to understand. This man wasn't evil in some supernatural sense. His brain wasn't fundamentally different from yours or mine at a neurological level. What was different was a combination of factors: exposure to trauma in childhood, a certain neurological predisposition, environmental stressors, access to victims, a series of decisions, each one lowering his inhibition further, until what had seemed unthinkable became thinkable, and then inevitable. This is what criminal psychology reveals. Most violent crimes are the product of a system of biology, psychology, environment, and circumstance. And systems can be understood, they can be predicted, they can, theoretically, be interrupted. One of the most important patterns in criminal psychology is what we call victim selection. Most offenders don't randomly select their victims. They select according to criteria, whether consciously or unconsciously. Some offenders target based on vulnerability. They select people who can't fight back effectively, children, the elderly, people with disabilities, people who are isolated or socially disconnected. Some offenders target based on symbolic meaning. They select victims who represent something to them. A woman who reminds them of someone who rejected them. A man who represents an authority figure. A particular race or ethnicity. The victim's specific identity is secondary to what they symbolize. Some offenders target based on opportunity and access. They select victims they have proximity to, people in their neighborhood, people they work with, family members. The victim selection is determined largely by who they encounter regularly. Understanding victim selection helps investigators narrow the suspect pool. If the victim was selected for vulnerability, the offender likely has some awareness of the victim's circumstances. If the victim was selected for symbolic reasons, the offender likely has some personal or psychological connection to the victim's identity. If the victim was selected for proximity, the offender is likely someone in the victim's immediate environment. I worked a case where victim selection was the key to solving a series of murders. Over a period of about 2 years, 5 women had been killed in a mid-sized city. The murders seemed disconnected at first. Different neighborhoods, different times, different methods. But when I examined the victims, a pattern emerged. All 5 victims were blonde women between the ages of 25 and 35 who worked in service industries. 3 were waitresses. 1 was a bartender. 1 was a hotel housekeeper. All 5 were killed in their own residences. All 5 showed signs of sexual motivation in the murders. The consistency of victim selection suggested someone who was specifically hunting this type of woman, someone for whom this physical type and this social position held symbolic meaning. I suggested to police that they look for someone who had a connection to service industry venues, someone who had access to these women, someone who likely frequented bars or restaurants, someone, possibly, who was working in that industry themselves. They cross-referenced the employees at various bars and restaurants with the neighborhoods where the victims had lived and worked. One name appeared in connection with locations that all 5 victims had frequented in the year before their deaths. That name belonged to a man in his early 40s who had been working as a bartender, a server, and a dishwasher at various establishments over the past decade. He had no prior criminal record. But when police brought him in for questioning and showed him photographs of the victims, something in his face shifted. He confessed to 3 of the 5 murders. He claimed not to remember the other 2, though he acknowledged he'd probably done them. He said he didn't know why he'd selected these women specifically. He just knew that when he saw them, when he served them drinks or cleared their tables, he felt something, an urge, a compulsion, and eventually that compulsion had overwhelmed his ability to resist it. The pattern of victim selection had led directly to the offender, because the offender had a system, and systems leave traces. The next critical pattern in criminal psychology is what we call fantasy rehearsal, or cognitive distortion. Most serious offenders, particularly those who commit sexual violence or premeditated murder, engage in extensive fantasy before committing their crimes. They imagine scenarios. They rehearse the crime mentally. They develop narratives that justify what they're planning to do. This fantasy isn't casual. It's often the primary activity in the offender's mind. They might spend hours per day thinking about potential victims, imagining scenarios, rehearsing their actions. Over time, the line between fantasy and reality begins to blur. The fantasy starts to feel more real than their actual life, and eventually, they decide to act on it. The rehearsal serves multiple functions. It allows the offender to mentally prepare for the crime. It desensitizes them to the act they're planning to commit. It reinforces the narrative that justifies the crime. And it intensifies the urge to actually commit it. This is where technology has become a critical factor in understanding criminal psychology. In the past, offenders were limited to fantasy within their own minds. Today, they have the internet. They have access to enormous amounts of material that reinforces their fantasies. They have communities online where they can discuss and share their thoughts with other people who have similar interests. Researchers have documented that offenders who have access to child sexual abuse material, for example, show increased likelihood of acting on their fantasies. The material doesn't cause the initial fantasy or compulsion, but it reinforces it. It normalizes it. It provides a template for how to act on it. Similarly, there are online communities where people discuss violent fantasies, where they share ideas about how to select victims, how to overcome resistance, how to avoid detection. These communities accelerate the progression from fantasy to reality. Law enforcement agencies now monitor these communities, specifically because they understand that they're watching the development of future offenders. Someone who joins a forum discussing child exploitation is more likely to actually exploit a child in the future than someone who never engages in that discourse. Someone who participates in a community that discusses rape fantasies is more likely to actually commit rape. The pattern is consistent and measurable. I consulted on a case where online activity was central to identifying an offender before he acted. A police department had received a report of someone using a public Wi-Fi network to distribute child sexual abuse material. Officers traced the Wi-Fi access point to a library. They reviewed security footage and identified a man in his early 50s. When police searched his residence, they found encrypted devices, extensive collections of material, and most importantly, detailed journals documenting his fantasies. The journals showed a clear progression. He'd been consuming this material for years. His fantasies had become increasingly elaborate and specific, and in his most recent journal entries, he was discussing specific children he'd observed in his neighborhood. Children at a playground, children at a bus stop, children at a local park. He hadn't acted yet, but the pattern was clear. He was in the pre-crime phase. He was moving from fantasy to planning. He was identifying specific targets and rehearsing specific scenarios involving those targets. His arrest and prosecution prevented what would likely have been sexual abuse crimes against children. The pattern recognition worked. One of the most complex patterns in criminal psychology is what we call compartmentalization. Many offenders are capable of maintaining multiple realities simultaneously. They have a public life where they function normally, maintain employment, have families, engage in community activities, and they have a secret life where they commit crimes and engage in violent fantasies. The two realities exist in separate compartments in their minds. They're able to shift between them with remarkable ease. This is why so many serious offenders surprise the people who know them. Friends and family say, "I can't believe he did that. He seemed so normal. He was a good father. He was involved in his church." There was no indication. The lack of indication isn't because the offender was secretly showing signs that everyone missed. It's because the offender genuinely was a good father in one compartment of his mind and a serious criminal in another. The compartments were completely separate. This ability to compartmentalize is related to, but distinct from, psychopathy. Many compartmentalizing offenders are not psychopaths. They actually feel remorse in one part of their mind. They genuinely love their families, but they're able to suppress that guilt and empathy when they're operating in their criminal compartment. I consulted on a case that exemplified this pattern. A man in his late 40s was arrested for a series of murders. He was a high school teacher with an exemplary record. He'd been teaching for 20 years. He had letters from parents praising his dedication to their children. He had awards from the school district for excellence in education. He was married with adult children of his own, and by all accounts was a devoted husband and father. And he had murdered 7 women over a 15-year period. When I interviewed him in prison, I asked him about this disconnect. How could he be both a beloved teacher and a serial murderer? His answer was fascinating. He said that the two roles existed in different parts of his mind. When he was teaching, he was genuinely engaged with his students. He cared about their development. He took pride in his work. That was real. When he was hunting, when he was selecting victims, when he was committing murders, he was in a different mental state entirely. He described it as switching. He could literally feel the shift happening. The part of his mind that cared about people, that had empathy, would simply go offline. And he'd be left with the part of his mind that saw people as objects, as targets. After the crime, he would switch back, and he would feel genuine horror and remorse about what he'd done. But the remorse didn't prevent him from switching again, because the capacity to switch was neurological, not something he could consciously control. This kind of compartmentalization exists on a spectrum. Some offenders have complete separation between their public and private selves. Others have significant overlap, but the pattern is common among serious offenders and explains why they can seem so normal on the surface while committing such terrible crimes. The study of criminal psychology also reveals patterns about impulsivity and planning. There's a common misconception that violent crimes are impulsive, that they happen in the heat of the moment. And certainly, some crimes are. A fight breaks out. Someone is carrying a weapon. Someone dies. But serious, violent crimes, serial murders, sexual assaults, calculated homicides, these are almost never truly impulsive. They're planned, sometimes extensively, sometimes obsessively. The level of planning often correlates with the severity of the crime. A murder committed during a robbery might be relatively unplanned. A serial murder is typically the result of years of planning, fantasy rehearsal, victim selection, and preparation. I worked with the law enforcement task force on a serial murder case where the extent of the planning was almost unbelievable. The offender had maintained detailed journals documenting his planning over a period of about 8 years before he committed his first murder. The journals included detailed descriptions of specific women he'd selected as targets, including their addresses, work schedules, daily routines, and security vulnerabilities, diagrams of their residences and possible entry points, descriptions of the method he planned to use to overcome resistance, descriptions of the acts he planned to commit, descriptions of how he planned to dispose of the body, descriptions of how he planned to evade detection. The specificity and detail were extraordinary. He wasn't fantasizing in a vague way. He was planning in meticulous detail. The first murder he actually committed matched one of his planned scenarios almost exactly. Same victim, a woman he'd identified years earlier. Same method, same disposal, same everything. The planning had been so extensive that when he actually committed the crime, it was almost anticlimactic to him. He was executing a plan he'd already rehearsed thousands of times mentally. This pattern-extensive pre-crime planning is one of the strongest predictors of future offending. Someone who is genuinely fantasizing is engaging in thought activity. Someone who is planning is one step closer to acting. And someone who has detailed plans is extremely likely to act on them. Law enforcement now takes planning documentation very seriously. If they find detailed plans or diagrams related to crimes, those are treated as indicators of immediate risk, not probable future risk, but immediate risk. The person is past the point of fantasy. They're in the execution phase. Another critical pattern in criminal psychology is the concept of control and power. Most serious violent crimes have a motivational component involving control and power over the victim. The offender wants to dominate, wants to demonstrate their power over someone vulnerable, wants to reduce their victim to an object, subject to their will. This is true even when the crime also has other motivations. A sexual assault might be motivated partly by sexual desire, but it's almost always also motivated by a desire to dominate and control. A murder might be motivated partly by financial gain, but it often also has an element of asserting control over life and death. Understanding this motivational component helps investigators and psychologists identify offenders and predict their behavior. If you're looking for someone who committed a crime that involved significant control and domination, you're looking for someone who has a psychological need for control in other areas of their life. I consulted on a case involving a series of home invasions where the primary motivation appeared to be control and domination rather than theft. The offender would break into homes, often when occupants were present, restrain them, and then spend hours controlling them, making them do things, humiliating them, demonstrating absolute power over them. In the offender's public life, he was someone with no control. He worked a low-level job where he took orders from managers who berated him. He had no romantic relationships. He lived with his mother. He was passive and submissive in all his interactions. But in the criminal compartment of his life, he was powerful. He was in complete control. He dominated completely. When we looked for suspects, we looked for someone whose public persona was one of powerlessness and submission, someone whose private life if we could access it, would reveal fantasies of complete dominance, someone who was building toward more serious crimes involving physical violence and permanent control, i.e., murder over victims. That profile led police to identify the offender, and when they arrested him and searched his residence, they found exactly what we'd predicted: detailed logs of his invasions and the domination scenarios he'd enacted, fantasies written down, plans for escalating to more serious crimes. The psychological need for control and power is one of the most consistent factors across serious offenders, and it's one of the most predictive of future dangerousness. Criminal psychology also reveals patterns about antisocial personality traits and psychopathy. There's a common misconception that all violent criminals are psychopaths. This is not true. Psychopathy is actually relatively rare, affecting maybe 1% of the population. But psychopaths are overrepresented in prisons, particularly in prisons for violent crimes. A psychopath, in the clinical sense, is someone who lacks the normal capacity for empathy and remorse. They can imitate these emotions, but they don't actually feel them. They have no genuine concern for how their actions affect other people. They're capable of manipulating people, lying, and causing harm without experiencing the emotional distress that normal people would feel. Psychopaths are not necessarily violent. Many psychopaths lead normal lives within the law. They might work in high-stress, high-power environments, where their lack of empathy is actually an advantage. They might be successful business executives or political leaders. But psychopaths who combine their lack of empathy with a willingness to use violence are extremely dangerous. Because they have no emotional constraint against harming others. They can hurt someone the way a non-psychopath might swat a fly without guilt, without remorse, without hesitation. I've interviewed many incarcerated offenders over my career. Most of them show some signs of remorse or emotional distress about their crimes, even if that remorse comes only after arrest. Most of them can articulate how their victim suffered and express some emotional response to that suffering. Psychopathic offenders, by contrast, often describe their crimes with complete emotional flatness. They might describe torturing someone for hours with the same neutral tone they'd use to describe eating breakfast. When asked whether they feel remorse, they often say no. When asked whether they would do it again if they thought they could get away with it, many say yes. One offender I interviewed had murdered a young woman in a particularly brutal fashion. He'd restrained her, tortured her, killed her, and disposed of her body. When I asked him to describe the experience, he discussed it in a detached, almost clinical way. He was curious about what she'd felt, not with empathy, but with scientific interest. How long had she screamed before her voice gave out? How much blood loss was necessary to cause unconsciousness? When I asked if he felt any remorse or guilt, he looked at me like I'd asked him a stupid question. "Why would I?" he said. "She's dead. That's in the past. Why would I waste emotional energy on something that's already happened?" That's psychopathy. The complete absence of emotional connection to the harm caused to others. Psychopathy is measurable, actually. There are assessment tools and scales that clinicians use. And one of the most important findings in criminal psychology is that psychopathy is predictive of future violence. Someone who scores high on psychopathy measures is substantially more likely to commit future violent crimes than someone who scores low. This is one of the reasons that some offenders are considered unsuitable for parole or release, even if their crimes are decades old. Not because they're still filled with rage or passion, but because the personality structure that allowed them to commit violence in the first place is still present. And if they're released, that personality structure will likely express itself in violence again. The pattern is measurable and predictive in a way that almost nothing else in psychology can claim to be. Criminal psychology also reveals patterns about childhood trauma and abuse. The research is clear. Most serious violent offenders have histories of significant childhood trauma, abuse, or neglect. Not all abused children become violent offenders, but almost all violent offenders were abused children. This is not an excuse for what they've done. Abuse does not excuse violence, but it's a pattern. It's part of the system. The abuse creates neurological changes, psychological damage, learned patterns of coping through aggression or dissociation, and those changes increase the likelihood of future violence. I've interviewed offenders who had been sexually abused as children, who had experienced severe physical abuse, who had watched their mothers being beaten, who had been neglected and abandoned, and almost without exception, their offense pattern involved recreating the trauma they'd experienced or inverting it, doing to others what had been done to them. An offender who had been sexually abused might become a child sex abuser. An offender who had been beaten might become a domestic violence offender, or a sexual sadist who inflicted pain on others. An offender who had been abandoned might become someone who collected victims, keeping them, controlling them, never letting them leave. The trauma creates a psychological template, a framework for how violence works. And once that template is established in childhood, it's extremely difficult to change. This is actually hopeful in one sense, because it means there's a point of intervention. If we can prevent childhood abuse, if we can interrupt the cycle before it establishes a template, we can prevent some future violence. But in terms of understanding offenders who've already been traumatized and who've already developed violent patterns, the childhood trauma is part of the system. It explains how they got to where they are, but it doesn't explain away what they've done. One of the most important patterns that criminal psychology has revealed is what we call desensitization through incremental escalation. Many offenders don't wake up one day deciding to commit serious violent crimes. They get there through a series of smaller steps. Each step desensitizes them to the previous one. Each step lowers their inhibition for the next one. Someone might start with fantasies, then pornographic material that aligns with their fantasies, then actual crimes that are less serious but similar in nature, then progressively more serious crimes. Each step normalizes the previous one. Each step makes the next one seem less extreme. The neurobiology of this is interesting. The human brain has an adaptation mechanism. If you're exposed to something repeatedly, your emotional response to it decreases. This is why people who watch a lot of violent media become less emotionally reactive to violence. Their nervous system adapts. This adaptation is actually useful in normal life. If you experience a traumatic event, your brain gradually adapts, and the emotional intensity of the memory decreases. This is healing. But for offenders, this adaptation mechanism works in the opposite direction. They become gradually less emotionally reactive to violence, to suffering, to their victims' distress. What initially horrified them becomes normal. What initially caused guilt becomes routine. I worked a case where this pattern was clear in the offender's own documentation. He'd maintained a detailed log of his crimes over a period of about 15 years. The log showed a clear progression. His first crime was relatively minor sexual assault of an adult woman. He was caught, prosecuted, served time. When he was released, he was supposed to be reformed. He went through the standard sex offender treatment programs. But then, about 3 years after his release, he committed another crime. This one was more serious: sexual assault of a minor. He was caught again, served more time. During his incarceration, he participated in the treatment programs again, expressing remorse, talking about his trauma, working through his issues. But then, he was released again, and several years later, he committed murder. Looking at his log, you could see the progression. Each crime desensitized him to the previous one, made it seem less extreme, made the next step seem more natural. The first crime caused him significant emotional distress, according to his own notes. The second crime caused less distress. The third crime caused none at all. It was just something he did. The pattern is consistent and documented across hundreds of cases. Offenders escalate because they're progressively desensitized. Each crime makes the next crime seem less extreme. Eventually, what seems unthinkable becomes routine. This is actually one of the reasons that our criminal justice system's current approach to reintegration has limitations. If we release someone who's committed serious violent crimes and simply expect them to reintegrate into society, we're relying on them not to encounter situations that would trigger the same patterns that led to their original crime. But for someone who's already committed violent crimes and who's already been desensitized, the natural trajectory is continued escalation, not reform. The crime is easier the second time. The guilt is less. The inhibition is lower. There are programs that can interrupt this trajectory. Treatment programs focused on developing genuine insight into their patterns and their motivations. But these programs require the offender to actually engage with them and to be motivated to change. For offenders who don't have that motivation, who maintain their criminal compartmentalization, the pattern continues. Another critical pattern in criminal psychology is the concept of victim blaming and blame shifting. Most offenders, even those with significant psychopathic traits, engage in some form of justification for their crimes. They minimize. They blame the victim. They reframe what they've done. Someone who commits rape might convince themselves that the victim wanted it, or at least deserved it. Someone who commits murder might convince themselves that the victim provoked it, or that they were protecting themselves. These rationalizations aren't entirely delusional. Offenders typically maintain some connection to reality, but they're distorted narratives that allow the offender to commit crimes while maintaining a sense that they're not actually a bad person. I interviewed an offender who had murdered his wife. By objective evidence, it was an extremely brutal murder. He'd stabbed her repeatedly, causing her to die of her wounds. When I asked him about it, he described it as an act of self-defense. According to his narrative, his wife had been attacking him. She'd been psychologically abusive. She'd been trying to destroy him, so he'd defended himself. His wife had been 5'4" and weighed 110 pounds. He was 6'2" and weighed 220 pounds. There was no evidence that she'd had a weapon. The injuries were far beyond what would be necessary for self-defense. By any objective measure, this was a murder, not a self-defense scenario. But he had created a narrative where it was self-defense. And he genuinely believed that narrative. It allowed him to commit a horrific act while maintaining a sense of moral justification. This kind of cognitive distortion is almost universal among serious offenders. It's part of the psychological system that allows violence to happen. The offender has to believe, at some level, that what they're doing is justified. Otherwise, the inhibition against harming others would prevent the crime. These distortions are also resistant to change. I've seen offenders sit through years of therapy and still maintain their original justifications. Because the distortion isn't a symptom of a disorder that can be treated. It's a foundational part of how their mind works. It's how they're able to commit violence. Criminal psychology also reveals patterns about substance abuse and offending. There's a strong correlation between substance abuse and criminal violence. Not because drugs or alcohol cause violence in the casual, pharmacological sense, but because substance abuse typically occurs in people who already have problems with impulse control, emotional regulation, or other risk factors for violence. Substance abuse also lowers inhibition. It reduces the cognitive capacity to engage in the kind of thinking that prevents violence. When someone is intoxicated, their impulses are more likely to be acted on. Their ability to consider consequences is impaired. Their empathy is reduced. But importantly, the substance abuse isn't the primary cause of the violence. The substance abuse is a comorbid condition in someone who already had a predisposition toward violence. I've worked cases where removing the substance abuse didn't eliminate the violence. The offender stopped using drugs or alcohol, and the violence continued. Because the underlying psychological structure, the impulse control problems, the pattern of aggression, the lack of empathy was still present. This is important for rehabilitation efforts to understand. If you want to reduce violence in an offender who's also abusing substances, you have to address both the substance abuse and the underlying violent patterns. Addressing only one or the other is usually insufficient. Criminal psychology also reveals patterns about the role of opportunity and proximity. Many crimes occur not because of a specific malicious plan, but because of opportunity and access. An offender has proximity to a potential victim. They're in a situation where the normal social or legal constraints on their behavior are removed or weakened, and they act. This is one of the reasons that certain professions, certain positions have higher rates of offending. Positions that give people access to vulnerable individuals and authority over them. Teachers, clergy, coaches, doctors, authority figures in institutions. It's not that these professions attract inherently violent people. It's that these professions provide opportunity and access to people who have violent inclinations and who might not otherwise act on those inclinations. Someone with a history of sexual interest in children might never act on that interest if they don't have access to children. But if they become a teacher or a coach or a youth counselor, suddenly they have regular access to children, and the position gives them authority. It makes children less likely to report them or be believed if they do report. The opportunity and access change the probability of offending, not causally, but significantly. This is one of the reasons that background checks, careful hiring, and oversight of people in positions of authority are so important. It's not that these measures are perfect at identifying offenders. It's that they reduce opportunity and increase the likelihood of detection. Criminal psychology also examines patterns in how offenders are caught or discovered. And one of the interesting findings is that most serious offenders are eventually caught. They don't stop on their own. They don't successfully hide forever. The reasons vary. Some are caught because of poor operational security. They leave evidence. They make mistakes. They underestimate law enforcement. Some are caught because of someone reporting them, an informant, a family member who discovers something, a victim who survives and can identify them. Some are caught through investigative techniques and forensics. But the underlying pattern is that offenders don't typically exit their criminal careers by retirement. They exit through incarceration. This is actually somewhat hopeful because it means that catching offenders is possible. It means that the criminal pattern, once started, tends to leave enough evidence and enough opportunity for detection that law enforcement can typically interrupt it. The question is whether they interrupt it before or after a significant number of victims have been harmed. One of the most profound patterns that criminal psychology has revealed is about the nature of evil itself. The people who commit serious, violent crimes aren't demons. They're not supernatural forces. They're human beings with brains and psychology and systems of thought that can be studied and understood. And understanding them doesn't require accepting them or excusing them. But it does require accepting that they're products of a system of biology, psychology, environment, and circumstance. That system is not impenetrable. It's not random, it's understandable. I've had conversations with serious offenders in which I've tried to understand their perspective, their motivation, their internal logic. And repeatedly, I've found that their logic is comprehensible. It's distorted. It's morally corrupt. But it's understandable. One offender described his logic about sexual violence this way: I knew it was wrong, but I also knew that I wanted to do it more than I cared that it was wrong. So I did it. And I told myself stories that made it okay, and then I did it again. That's the system, not a supernatural compulsion, not insanity in the legal sense, just a human psychology where the desire to commit a crime was stronger than the inhibition against it. And once he acted on that desire, the inhibition against future similar acts decreased. The cycle continued. Understanding that system allows us to interrupt it. It allows us to identify people at high risk of offending and potentially intervene. It allows us to design prisons and treatment programs that actually reduce recidivism rather than simply warehousing people. But it requires accepting that we're dealing with comprehensible human psychology, not incomprehensible evil. Criminal psychology also reveals something important about prevention. Most prevention efforts focus on detecting offenders after they've already committed crimes. We catch them, try them, incarcerate them, hopefully prevent them from offending again. But there are also prevention efforts that focus on the earlier parts of the system, on identifying people with risk factors and intervening before they commit serious crimes. This is controversial because it involves intervening in people's lives before they've actually broken the law. It involves treating thoughts and fantasies as criminal precursors. But the research is clear. The pattern of escalation is real. Someone who's engaging in serious criminal fantasies, who's consuming material related to their fantasies, who's beginning to research victims or methods, is significantly more likely to act on those fantasies than someone who isn't doing those things. Law enforcement agencies are beginning to invest in intervention programs. If someone is caught accessing child sexual abuse material for the first time, instead of simply prosecuting them, agencies might offer treatment. Cognitive behavioral therapy focused on reducing the appeal of the material, help developing better coping mechanisms, support in changing the thought patterns. Some of these programs have shown promise in reducing reoffense rates, but prevention at the earliest stage, childhood education about healthy sexuality, treatment for people with dangerous paraphilias before they offend, addressing childhood trauma and abuse, these are the interventions most likely to actually reduce serious, violent crime. Criminal psychology tells us that the system of violence can be interrupted at multiple points. The earlier the intervention, the more likely it is to succeed. After all these years of studying criminal behavior, of interviewing offenders, of analyzing crime scenes and investigating cases, what I've come to believe is that violence is not inevitable, but it is systemic. Every serious violent offense is the result of a system: biological, psychological, environmental, situational. Remove any part of that system, and the crime might not happen. The child who was abused might not have been abused in a different family. The teenager with violent impulses might not have acted on them in a society with better mental health resources. The adult with a criminal plan might not have had access to victims in a community with better oversight. None of these interventions would have prevented all violence. Violence is probably inherent to human nature to some degree, but they would prevent some. And some prevention is better than none. This is what criminal psychology offers society. Not a way to eliminate violence entirely, but a way to understand it, a way to predict it, a way to intervene before it happens. And that's a profound thing, actually. To know that we're not helpless in the face of criminal violence. To know that the patterns can be understood and addressed. I'm nearing the end of my career now. I've consulted on hundreds of cases. I've interviewed hundreds of offenders. I've analyzed countless crime scenes and offense patterns. And I've learned that the worst human beings are not incomprehensible. They're not alien. They're human beings with human psychology, operating within systems that can be understood and studied, which means that, in theory, we can do better. We can prevent more crimes. We can identify dangerous individuals earlier. We can interrupt the pattern before it results in victims. That's the hope that criminal psychology offers. Not a perfect solution, but a better one than we have now. The architecture of violence is complex, but it's not impenetrable. And that makes all the difference. I'm Dr. Elizabeth Chen. I've spent 23 years studying criminal psychology, and I believe that understanding the system of violence is the first step toward preventing it.